Where in the hell's the collared shirt? You said you were going to wear one.
No, I lied. I just put it on, but it was hot in my room here. I just opened the window and I'm in Chicago, but I had to take the collared shirt off. And my restaurant in Chicago is Brant's of Palatine, so I like to rep it whenever I can.
No, that's good. Had I thought about it, I just took my tie and coat off, this is more natural habitat.
I was intimidated into wearing one of the only collared shirts that I still own.
You actually, wow, Bobby in a collared shirt is very unusual. So we're off to a good start already. Welcome to the Futures Edge podcast. I'm Jim Urio. That's Bob Iacchino. In the middle is Kevin Roberts, who is the president of the Heritage Foundation. You guys who watch this show a lot know a couple things, is that 60-70% of the shows we do is heavy finance, heavy economics. We have top economists on, but then the rest of the shows, we go on to things that we think are important. We think this is monumentally important. Kevin, for you, most of our viewers are like, people in finance, people in the trading world tend to be libertarian. Often they call themselves Republicans, but they're really libertarians. Now, most of these people, myself included, sat on the sidelines. All we wanted out of this life was to work our ass off, make some money, raise our kids, practice our faith, and go along with shit. We did not want some weird old culture war being brought to our doorsteps that we didn't want to fight, nor do we even really understand. The point I'm trying to make is that we as individualists are at a distinct disadvantage battling against this globalist cabal that exists, and Kevin will answer that question a little bit, or even just the collectivists who by their very nature are better at grouping together to fight us. Sometimes we have to dust off our pocketbook, blow the dust off, and give to foundations like the Heritage Foundation. Now, if you remember Kevin, he was the one who gave that epic rant at Davos. Well, there's two people who gave epic rants at Davos, but Kevin is the only one who had a morally defensible hairstyle, Javier Milei being the other, and I got you with that one, didn't I? Okay, good. And Javier Milei being the other, which he needs better friends to tell him what to do with his hair. But thank you for coming on the show, Kevin Roberts. Where are you coming to us from?
I am in the Imperial City, Washington, D.C., from the studios at Heritage. So it's a real pleasure to be with you guys. And, my girls, we've got 2 teenage girls still at home. I told them about what I was doing today, including being on your show, which I honestly have been looking forward to, even after that introduction for some reason. And they said, Dad, maybe you should surprise them with a Javier Milei wig. But I decided not to do that.
Oh, that would have been funny.
Outstanding. By the way, I'll defend his hair as someone who had that hair in the 80s. I'll defend his hair all day.
Oh, I did too. But the look, like the bald look, my wife, like when she saw Matt Nagy coaching on the sidelines the other day, my wife thinks the bald look with the facial hair, like I'm thinking of shaving myself bald and growing facial hair just because that's what she seems to always like. Isn't Matt Nagy good looking? No, he's just okay.
He's a bald guy. Someone came up to my wife a few months ago and I was not bald when we met, obviously. And this lady said, "Man, you must think bald men are really handsome." And she looked at me and my wife said, "He had a lot of hair when I met him."
but sure. Yeah. So obviously Kevin's on the show because there was a huge lapse in the vetting process at the Heritage Foundation, which is fine. And before we get to some real stuff, and again, you guys know that we talk about some serious shit on the show and we're going on this, but we also like to have fun with it too. So let's get rid of the nonsense first. Favorite movie, favorite place to vacation, and your favorite drink.
Favorite movie would be Unforgiven with my favorite actor, Clint Eastwood, and others.
Outstanding.
Favorite vacation is anywhere in the Rocky Mountains, but particularly Wyoming. Okay. Hiking, horse riding up to mountain lakes up in the Wind River Mountains near where we used to live. And favorite drink is an old fashioned.
Fantastic. A Wisconsin old fashioned with brandy or a whiskey old fashioned?
An old fashioned, which would have
no. Okay. Sorry.
What's this Wisconsin stuff?
We're on the wrong foot already. Cancel this. Oh, I have a place up in the mountains that I don't go to enough. But there's horse riding, right? We have like 2 acres up in near Winter Park, Colorado. I just love the mountains. I'm a beach guy in the winter, but in the summer we go up to the mountains and I just absolutely love it. But anyway, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. Let's cut right to it. The Heritage Foundation. Here's my question. It's gonna be short. You said we're gonna talk about things we're gonna fight for, and we're gonna talk about things we're gonna fight against. Over the last 5 years, here's where I find myself is, and am, and I want you to talk me out of it. I barely even care what the Republican policies are anymore. 100% of my focus is on fighting the nonsense that keeps coming down the pipeline. What is it that I'm fighting for, or am I just fighting against?
The key thing you're fighting for is the American dream, which I know sounds trite, so I'll be a little substantive there. And in fact, maybe we'll get into some of the research that we've done that really exemplifies that Americans across the political spectrum, Jim, are saying the same thing you're saying. And for them, for you, for me, for all of us at Heritage, it kind of doesn't matter the specific institution that was the straw that broke the camel's back. The common thread for all of us, regardless of who we were voting for before we decided, like you and me, we're done with the Republican Party. For them, maybe the Democrat Party. There was some institution that they say, that we say, betrayed us. And it betrayed us because it kept telling us that, as Paul Krugman would want us to believe, everything's fine. Everything in the United States is just wonderful. Just, persevere a little bit through the more expensive gas, groceries, and rent. But ultimately, what we're fighting for is the American dream, not just for us as individuals and individualists, but even if we don't mean this in a collective sense, and the three of us certainly don't mean it in a collective sense, we mean it, at least I do, I'll speak for myself, maybe with a little bit of ethical or moral obligation to others. We want our fellow Americans to have the American dream if, in fact, they're willing to work for it, right? And the fact that we have tens of millions of Americans who've been busting their tails forever, and maybe they've gotten ahead a little bit, but they have to scrape even harder. They have to hustle even more than those of us who've hustled to get where we are, you guys and probably all of your audience. It tells us that something is broken in America. I would say largely with the government, maybe also with some institutions. What we're fighting for is to revitalize that. The it itself, the dream itself, economically, socially, politically, but even more than that, that Americans would wake up one day soon and say a majority of us believe that the American dream is still possible. That would mean that, in fact, we've begun to win.
So, Kevin, I read your op-ed, What I Learned at Davos, and I loved it. I mean, it got me so excited for this particular show. And you mentioned something in there about being, well, it was really the whole theme of the article. I want you to talk about it if you can, but you talked about being optimistic after being at Davos. I am by nature a pessimistic person, and I'm aggressive and I'm confrontational, and I'm not optimistic at all. But you mentioned, this is the part that got me thinking, the managerial elites. And I equated that to sort of the useless middle management that is in some of these inefficient companies. Is that what you were referring to? Tell people about the op-ed itself and then answer that question if you don't.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I'm a little less optimistic since I heard y'all say that brandy goes in an old fashioned. But that point aside,
I did not say that.
Wisconsin's a wonderful state. It's
it
just
is
30 miles to the north of me now.
That point aside, what was your question? No, you were asking about Davos and the op-ed, and sort of counterintuitively why I would be more optimistic since leaving. Well, because these people live in a bubble, and the bubble, while involving influential people, I'm not trying to dismiss their influence. They have it. We've lived under their regime. It's actually begun to be pierced, and pierced not necessarily just by me or President Millet or people like you who are paying attention, but pierced by folks with common sense. And the awakening that just sort of everyday people have, Bob, to your question, is that the people who've been telling us that they are the experts, they're the so-called public health experts during COVID. They're the so-called economic experts like Krugman, who tell us everything is fine. They're the education experts who tell us that our kids actually are learning a lot. But then we got to see during COVID and some of the other ridiculous remote days since that time, they're not learning. They actually have no earthly idea what they're talking about. And the reason is this, just to put one more sort of level of detail on this. I've thought about this a lot as someone who suffered under academia for a long time as a conservative, with a lot of middle managers who are useless. The technocratic elites who are running countries, who are ambassadors, who are members of the European Union, they came from that class of useless middle managers. They may be perfectly fine, sweet people, but the thing that they get wrong that actually I think is fairly nefarious actually is that they want to impose their view of the world on us, and they're not even largely competent in doing so. A few of them are, particularly in the worlds of finance and entrepreneurialism. But the point of the op-ed was to say that the gig's up. that people, not just in America, but around the world, have discovered this. And in fact, we're on the brink of turning the corner that not only rejects these managerial elites, these technocrats, but if you look at the United States, if you look at the Netherlands, you look at Italy, at Argentina, the list could go on and on and on. People are rising up against these people and against these self-appointed elites. And that gives me great hopefulness about the short term. But it's really important, just to write a postscript on this, that I will remain hopeful if and only if we realize that our hope lies not just in political elections going well, but in the outright, utter rejection of these people in power. And what that looks like, to kind of bring it down to what I like to call the sidewalk level, what that looks like is that in your local school district, even if you don't have kids in your public schools, your own kids in the public schools, that a majority of the money that you spend on those public schools doesn't go to that class of useless middle managers. Imagine this. It actually would go to the classrooms. It would actually go to teachers, because let me just introduce one more fact. We've seen a significant increase in education spending in the last 25 years. The majority of that spending has gone to non-instructional expenses. That is to say, to those middle managers who not only are useless, but in some cases really harmful.
So in that article, you mentioned how you're optimistic because people are waking up to things. Can you pinpoint sort of a trigger to that? Was it COVID? Was it transgenderism? Was it the lies about inflation? And by lies, I'm not pinpointing a party. Something Jim and I refuse to do in this podcast is talk about a political party. We're talking about policy, right? So when somebody, Krugman, I'll pinpoint them. When he says, people are complaining about inflation because they don't understand economics. As opposed
He doesn't
to
understand economics. He should blame. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they don't understand eggs are up 85% from pre-COVID levels. They understand that. But can you pinpoint sort of where that trust was lost and maybe where I think what all three of us are seeing as a general public awakening to this sort of gaslighting that goes on both sides?
Yeah, but I love the fact that y'all just ignore the two major political parties. I think that's the right thing to do. I sort of knew that before I got up here to Washington to lead Heritage 2 years ago. But trust me, 2 years of experience in Washington will convince you of that. So speaking about the policies in the awakening, I think it was COVID, Bob. I think that COVID, which every reasonable person in the first weeks and months realized this will kill you. We need to take some rational steps. Y'all were probably like me and my wife and people closest to us who said, I sort of trust the people around me to make decisions about their health. I don't mind the guidance, especially from my governor, who then was Greg Abbott. I certainly didn't mind the guidance from the Trump administration. But then after about a month, I realized, oh my gosh, these technocrats who have some abstract system in mind, as opposed to each of us living our own lives as the key focus for them, they're either wrong or they're incompetent, or worse still, and I sort of hate saying it, they're compromised. And then what happened is Americans were going through that realization. Americans with kids at home or with grandkids that they saw often, and they're now working at home or at school at home, they realized, first of all, the implementation of doing school at home was really bad. But then if they were helping the kids with the instruction and the lessons, they realized, oh my gosh, what I sort of remember rattling around in the back of my head, which is that American educational achievement has been in a steady decline for 40 years. I'm seeing it with my own child. These people are lying to me. And then this is like a snowball, right? They start going to school board meetings and they realize at the heart of that was this ridiculous concept of gender ideology. Someone could be not only a radical leftist, but themselves be in a same-sex relationship and realize this is a ridiculous concept, gender ideology. And these people, these elites, the school board members, the people they hire to run the schools, are telling me, a perfectly rational person, that I'm wrong about all of these things. And it's when, on top of all of those pieces of recognition, the elite said, you're wrong. You need to listen to us. I think the dam broke. And it's about the time that dam was breaking that we realized the impact of inflation, which, by the way, to your point, both parties deserve blame for, with overspending, especially at the federal level. And Americans have had enough. And I think that's why right now, at this bottom, this nadir of American economic, social might, I think we're going to see a real climbing out of that. And I won't be so ridiculously optimistic as to say we're going to reach heights we've never reached. I don't know about that yet. I'd like to get out of that dip first, but I do know that it's happening as I travel the country and to some extent travel the world. People are fed up.
I had like 4 different topics I want to hit just from what you just said, but I want to the gender ideology thing just real briefly. We had Brianna Watley on our show, who I don't know if you know who she is. She was a high school debate champion, and she was kicked out of debate because she defended Donald Trump foreign policy at one debate. So she was kicked off her team. She went on all the news circus, and she was fantastic. We started talking about the gender ideology thing in high school because she's a high school senior, and we agreed on one thing. We have no idea what they want from us. You know what I mean? Do you want me to fight for your right to be a woman or be a man or be gay? I'll fight for your right to do for your individual rights. Oh, that's in our DNA. Mostly Bobby and I grew up liking to fight in Chicago, but I'll fight for them anytime. But what else is there beyond that? If they're nice to me, I'll be nice to them. I don't want it. I don't want you talking about sexuality with my 4th grader ever in the public school system. What am I missing?
You're not missing anything. The people who are missing something are those people who are foisting that ideology on us. The good news, Jim, is as you know, it's a very small percentage of Americans, like a tiny fraction of 1% of Americans who actually believe fully all of that nonsense. But then they're people of influence, and they realize, sort of to the thread thus far in our conversation, if they can persuade the managerial elites, the managerial class, that this is a good idea, this being gender ideology, then they have been able to infiltrate our institutions. I've spent a lot of time the last year, especially thinking about how is it that the radical left, with their just a fraction of 1% of people who believe what they believe, get access into our institutions, and then our institutions lord over us, right? That's the pain that we feel, even the emotion thus far in our conversation. And it is because, once again, the managerial class just takes orders. And then they implement those orders, and some of them are really, really good implementers. If you're missing anything, it's the same thing that I'm missing, at least was missing for a long time, which is that if we're going to correct this, it's not enough just to rail against the problem. We do need to speak out against it. We need to find people like the young person you mentioned earlier, or the athletes who've been savaged by this gender ideology nonsense. But particularly for us at Heritage, for me, we have to have a laser focus on eliminating the power of that managerial class in our institutions, because they are the ones who host the conferences. They host the monthly workshops that explain why all of this nonsense is good. I happen to know more about that than I would like, having spent so many years in education. And look, that's when this was only the beginning of this nonsense. It really is sort of a daily battle for people who are in the trenches, if you will, in those institutions.
Okay, that's interesting, and let's put that to bed, because I think everyone watching here understands that we don't understand what's going on, nor do we ever want to understand that too. Let's talk. You mentioned about the pendulum swinging. There is one thing I think that worries me quite a bit, and I know Bob knows what I'm going to mention. Things like digital ID, central bank digital currency. Even today, Elizabeth Warren gave out a tweet, and I can't remember exactly what the wording was, but thinly veiled in that was digital currency, digital ID. It was something about filing your taxes, getting rid of the middlemen, and just being involved with the government themselves. And I understand taxpayer and tax collector is a government individual relationship, but it sounded to me like somewhere in there was this bullshit. Do you, at the Heritage Foundation, by the way, if you say anything on this show that you want canceled out, just tell us and we will. But I doubt you will, by the way.
Nope. I feel like I'm at home. This is awesome.
So central bank digital currency and digital ID. Where does the Heritage Bank? I know you're probably against them, but what level of against?
A 100 on a scale of 1 to 10 against, and I'll tell you why. Not just the merits or lack thereof of the policy. So we were just at Heritage looking at this in terms of policy balls and strikes. There's nothing that commends these ideas to be to put into action, certainly to the extent Senator Warren would like. The digital ID, the central bank digital currency, those are two things that I intended to mention, by the way, when I was on the stage at Davos. And I was walking off, I said, I have one regret. I didn't mention that because I really wanted to see the heads fully explode. Why? This is a religion to people who want to completely control our lives, reasons that you not only know, but I know you explain on your show a lot and your audience knows. Let me just conclude this comment with this point, Jim. The regime in Washington, which unfortunately has members of both parties, particularly in the Senate, but some in the House, desperately want the central bank digital currency because they want to completely control our lives. That sounds conspiratorial. Even as I sit here and I hear myself say that, I think, Roberts, man, you kind of sound like tinfoil hat. Guys, it's totally true. The high-powered, smart economists we have at Heritage say the same thing. We don't engage in conspiracy theory. This ought to scare the daylights out of us. So that's why we're 100 against it on a scale of 1 to 10.
But it's funny is that I used to be a conspiracy theory, but then all my conspiracies came true. So now I'm looking for new ones. And the thing about the central bank digital currency, and I work with some leftists who will argue, like, what do you mean they don't want control? Every government that's ever ruled people on this planet has wanted more control. Now with technology, the ability to surveil and the ability to gather intel, now all of a sudden the door's been kicked wide open for that to be actually possible. This to me is absolutely terrifying. Before you mentioned COVID and COVID response, and you mentioned 3 possibilities: incompetence, something else, and you mentioned nefarious. Do you want to take a stand where you think, in looking back 4 years, do you think what from the government there was an element of sinister, an element of nefarious, an element of a power grab that came from this?
Yeah, there will be at least 2 categories of people I mentioned. The first would be the Chinese Communist Party. They deserve not total blame for this, because the rest of the blame, they deserve a lot of blame. The rest of the blame speaks to the second category, nefarious. And I'll name names. I think Tony Fauci's terribly compromised. I think that at first he seemed very confident in what he was saying. He never has stopped being confident in what he was saying, but it doesn't mean that he was competent, nor did it mean that he was well-intentioned. And I think that what we have learned since then, including some research that we've done at Heritage and is publicly available on our website, indicates that there were people in our government who knew a lot of things that they were doing simply didn't make sense, whether that's masking, whether that's the vaccines. We now see all kinds of evidence, which we're cataloging at Heritage, of the impact of that. In other words, people in your audience can say, Kevin, come on now. If there's another epidemic, I'm wearing a mask, I'm going to get a vaccine, totally fine. But I say today the same thing that I was saying when I was in Austin, Texas, and refused to shut down the organization that I was leading, the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And guys, I was giving a gigantic FU to the city of Austin. I dared them to come into our building and say, you can't work, because I wanted them to sue us, because I just wanted to take them to the cleaners. But the point wasn't like the fundraising interest that would come from that, although it would have been glorious. It was to take a stand on common sense and say, how about this novel concept? Leading a conservative organization, I trust the people I work with to make decisions for their lives and for the betterment of the people they work with and the people around them. And Anthony Fauci, I am convinced 100%, guys, not 90, not 50. Anthony Fauci is compromised, and I surely look forward to conservatives who want to actually have some real accountability, getting him back in front of Congress and there being real consequences. I don't think the public knows everything that we ought to know about what happened with the COVID lockdowns.
Bobby, why is everything so expensive? Just to put a point on this, I haven't brought my lunch to work in 20 years, and my 3 eggs and bacon used to cost $7. Now they cost $14. My wireless bill was so expensive. Why the heck is wireless so expensive?
I don't know. I mean, it feels like a car payment from 10 years ago, what you pay for wireless now. I mean, what are you paying all that money for? Is it speed, coverage, data? Is it this 5G that we all needed access to? Unlimited talk and text, which I feel like we've had forever. Mobile hotspots, which I don't use all that much. What are we paying all that money for?
This is not going to come as a surprise to you, but we have the answer right here on the Futures Edge podcast, because the Futures Edge podcast is partnering with Mint Mobile. Mint Mobile offers all these features for as low as $15 per month. It's built on the nation's largest 5G network. The reason it keeps costs low is because they sell direct to you online. They cut out the retail stores. They cut out the salespeople. It's just a much more efficient process.
Like, why should anybody have to pay more than you have to for access to the same exact network? Go to mintmobile.com/futuresedge. Also linked to the show description to get a premium wireless service for, you ready for it? $15 a month.
Okay, and if you're like people who are old, like Bobby and I, we don't like to change anything. We don't like our routines to change. Now, you want to know how hard it is to switch your service? Well, the big wireless companies want you to think it's really hard, but switching to Mint Mobile is super easy thanks to their digital eSIM card, which most phones now have. You can sign up and activate immediately right on your phone from the comfort of your home. If your phone doesn't have an eSIM, Mint will ship you a new SIM card for free. How about that?
Jimmy and I talk about not wanting anyone to tell us what to do, that sort of libertarian bent that we both have. Well, big wireless wants you to think they're the only option. So do not be fooled. Go to mintmobile.com/futuresedge. Also, again, linked in the show description, and stop paying more than you have to for your phone plan. By the way, now through the end of January, new customers can get any plan for just $15 a month when they purchase 3 months or more. This includes the unlimited plan, which is normally $30 a month. So not only are you going to save the difference between your current plan and Mint Mobile's normal pricing, but you're going to save $45 for 3 months or more if you sign up for more versus Mint's own normally low prices. Complete no-brainer. Don't even think about it. Go to mintmobile.com/futuresedge.
But maybe you should wait till after you watch the podcast. We don't want you guys leaving the podcast right now. So watch the podcast first and then go to Mint Mobile and hit that link. Thank you, guys.
It's funny when we talk about, you use the word compromise. Jim and I use nefarious all the time. Probably about 5 years back, I was like Kay Adams, Corleone in Godfather, where she said to Michael when he came back from Italy, senators and presidents don't have men killed. And then Michael said, who's being naive now, Kay? I was Kay for a long time, where I sat there and said, by the way, that's my favorite movie. Jimmy asked me in the very first show. I never got to say it again. When I think about this, I can't get my head anywhere else because some of these people are horrible human beings. Some of them are dumb as a bag of hammers, but some of them are smart enough to know what they're doing. And what worries me the most, and I want you to talk me down off the ledge, is the fact that the other choice, which that in and of itself always worries me, that we get one choice or the other. The other choice is very much likely to be President Trump, former President Trump, which for a lot of people represents the same thing I'm describing on the other side right now. So do you think that is sort of a sort of a dead spot for people where it's just, he can't, with him around, the things that the three of us most likely believe, I think we agree on a lot of things right off the bat, can't be provable with him in office?
I understand what you're saying, relating about what some people think about President Trump, and in no way an endorsement, because I can't do that. If I did that, the IRS would definitely put me in jail.
Not mine either, but
yeah, I understand. I always have to issue that caveat. That what's at stake is a lot. And what's at stake, frankly, to kind of come full circle back to your wonderful first question, Jim, is the American dream. I'm not suggesting that any individual has the power to just snap his or her fingers and magically restore that. But what I am not just suggesting, but imploring people to keep in mind is that in the last 3 years, we've experienced what the lack of the American dream looks like. And during COVID, frankly, we experienced a year plus of what the lack of the American dream looked like. And I find it gratifying that President Trump, for the most part, has acknowledged that. And therefore, the acknowledgement of, to the extent that he's able to do that, given that he's a New Yorker, y'all appreciate that being Chicago guys, and say that things would be different, I think he is going to come into office actually much more mature. I don't mean that to sound so condescending toward him, but I would be more mature if I were a second-term president and understand where the gaps are in the administrative state that require him, with his unparalleled gut instinct, his unparalleled intuition, to go fix. I do think, to sum up here, that our only hope, if the choices are what they currently are, of getting to the bottom of what happened in COVID, is to have not only people like Rand Paul continue to be in the Senate, and not only to have not just conservatives, but maybe some common sense people who are in the other party in the House, but also a conservative presidential administration, among other priorities, say, not for the sake necessarily of just accountability on COVID, but so that we never repeat this again. We're going to get to the bottom of what happened in 2020 and 2021.
So off of that then, based on what you've said, it seems to me like you guys do a lot of polling, right? You do a lot of focus groups. And you have a list of what, at least from your polling and your focus group, are the most important things to Americans. What are those, at least the voting Americans? What are those, and where do they apply versus the two candidates seems to be that we're going to have left to choose from?
We do a lot of polling. We say what we say. We're going to work on what we work on because we think it's important. But we spent a lot of time the last couple of years, Bob, trying to figure out the best way to message that, because politics are so polarized, to state the obvious. And we also want to appeal to, we at Heritage, just thinking about our ideas, we want to appeal to a segment of Americans who are in the center or maybe a little on the center right, who, if they hear the word conservative, they may not, they think describe themselves. If they hear the word heritage, they probably don't even know who we are. But if they do, maybe we're a little too quote unquote conservative for them. And so I'll say two things. The first about them, and then secondly about the electorate writ large. The first is people in the center understand that their situation is less secure than it was. And when our facilitators in these focus groups, as a good facilitator does, sort of leads them to explain that more, it's totally open-ended, in other words. So the focus group is more valuable to us than the polls. Invariably, whether they're Black men or white women, they say public safety in my town has declined. And for some Americans across the political spectrum, it's declined to the extent like people in the neighborhood at Heritage, a nice part of Washington, D.C., have to be really careful walking alone at night. The second thing they say is obviously something of interest to y'all too. They're economically insecure, that something has happened, particularly in the last 3 years. They don't necessarily draw the connection to the Inflation Reduction Act, but they understand the government is spending too much money, because $34 trillion is a lot of money. And the third thing that they say in some form or another is that the American dream is insecure, or what their parents taught them or their family taught them. And there is a huge opportunity for either of the big political movements in this country to speak to the people in the middle. But the problem for the left is that they are, I will say, they are responsible for the decline in public safety in our cities. These are George Soros funded mayors and district attorneys. That is on their shoulders entirely. The second thing on economic insecurity, while the Republicans did overspend, President Trump overspent. I said that when he was president. Heritage said that. If he's president again and he overspends, we will say that. The level of overspending by President Biden and his allies in Congress has reached proportions that are almost difficult to comprehend, as y'all know very well. And then the third thing, the American dream, I actually think both the left or the right could appeal to this. But right now, given the way the country's thinking, which is that the country's weak, we have real concerns, which I think are legitimate, about President Biden's health. I don't mean that as an uncharitable comment, it's just obvious. I think the country is realizing, even though we don't necessarily like mean tweets, even though some Americans, for whatever reasons they offer, wouldn't list Donald Trump as their primary person to articulate all these concerns, the thing that we hear repeatedly in these focus groups is that he was competent, that he understood their plight. I mean, some really poor people in these focus groups say that. It's very interesting for them to offer this. And while they might not choose his personality, they understand that he was someone who was competent. And I think that contrast, now that it's early 2024, is likely to remain the same all the way through November.
So there's something I want to gloss on. You mentioned some of these urban mayors, and I've written quite a bit about this, is that I don't blame Brandon Johnson for shit in Chicago. He was very, very clear on his pro-crime policies. They're like he listed them out. He was going to make it a more crime-friendly city. Like, I say that to people, and like, what are you talking about? No, here's what I'm talking about. No pursuits for other than violent crime, no cash bail, no decriminalizing things under $1,000, which he didn't do, but he talked about doing. Defunding the police. What the hell do these people think those things mean? There is criminals, and there is the rest of the of humanity. And if your policies favor them, that's pro-crime. I mean, it's quite obvious. You mentioned something else that was interesting too, that I'd like to dig in a little bit further. Jason Furman, Bobby and I know 20 high-end economists, 20 who've worked in the government. Most of them are right libertarian economists, Brian Westbury's, Bob Stein's, Joe Livorni's of the world. But we also know, I know Jason Furman, who worked for Obama. And here's what I ask these people, Paul Krugman as well. If you mentioned the good economy that you keep talking about, and Keynesian economics preaches that in a downturn, you increase government deficit spending to take the edge of a downturn. Why the hell are you spending money like drunken sailors currently if it really is a good economy? And why do you say it's a good economy without ever mentioning that fact? What do you got on that?
They're hiding. No, I mean ultimately nothing. What they would say, and I did ask a few people in Davos about this, and I asked people in Washington, generally people who disagreed with me. Right? How do you explain this? Help me understand. And a couple of times I'm trying to be intellectually honest, and ultimately what it boils down to is that they think that they can inflate themselves out of this problem, or what I should say, especially to the two of you, given your expertise, is inflate on our backs out of this problem. And it really comes the conversation comes full circle.
And I try to explain to people all the time is that the inflation wasn't something that just happened. The inflation was 100% intentional. They told us they were going to do it. They told us how they were going to do it, and then they did it. And they needed to do it. Like, just take Illinois, who was $200 billion in deficit. The only way they could ever rescue Illinois was for significant inflation to monetize that debt. I mean, it's just baffling to me to see that commercial in the Super Bowl with Joe Biden pointing the finger at different companies for giving you less potato chips. What in the name of God are you talking about, man? You are the one who is causing the inflation, and you said you were gonna. Are people that dumb that they'll still vote for it?
Yes.
That's what I thought so too. So we got our work cut out for us, obviously, right?
We do. This is why we're doing these focus groups. I don't think we've ever done focus groups with Americans in the political center at Heritage, because it's been sufficient for us to be able to not just preach to the choir. You know, the political right's pretty wide and diverse, as our conversation indicates, but we realize we've got to, at Heritage, we see this as a moral obligation, frankly. We've got to help rebuild and expand the center right movement in this country, not changing the principles. We're just not going to do that at Heritage. It's not who we are, but be savvy, not be duplicitous, savvy about how we message and what we lead with. And so what we're leading with on all of these points is, if you know that your gas, groceries, and rent are costing you more in 2024 than they did in 2021, then you really need to rethink who you might be voting for. And not just for the president of the United States, not just for Congress, but all the way down to your state legislator and your city councilman.
Every race is local. Okay, things are about to take a turn here that we might not like as much, because this, we've had softball things that we all agree on, and this might be something we don't agree on. And I don't know if Heritage has a position on it. If not, that's fine. The last election, the midterms, the leaking of the Roe v. Wade document and then the revelation of it, was an enormous thing that swung people over. I think it's a hot button issue for women on the left to think of, in their description, old white guys making the decision how to use their body and what can and can't be done, which is ironic coming from the party that wanted to knock down doors and vaccinate everybody and give up their health autonomy. My opinion is this, and I want to tell you where I'm wrong. I believe, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Christian. I believe that abortion is morally wrong. I believe that it's an awful thing. I also believe that it's difficult for me to insert myself into that position between a doctor and someone who's going to that doctor. I don't know what the resolution is in my own head of those things. Where does the Heritage Foundation stand on that?
Yeah, we mostly agree. It sounds like we disagree on the tail end of what you said. The Heritage Foundation is unabashedly pro-life, not that you aren't, but what that means for us is, and I'll get to the near-term circumstances that are difficult, so I want to acknowledge that on the front end. We are 100% pro-life. We look forward to the day when abortion doesn't exist in the country. We really mean that. My guess as a historian of American politics is it may take the rest of the century to get there, because ultimately abortion, if in fact people agree that that's the goal, that's really going to be a matter for individuals, for not just churches, but for communities to decide. And in other words, this shouldn't surprise you coming from this kind of Edmund Burke conservative. Institutions, our local communities are far upstream politics. The recognition that we've made at Heritage, and I think this is meaningful for people across the political spectrum who know how pro-life we are, is that candidates for whom in their district this is a really big issue, they ought not lead with the issue of abortion. I would argue as a pro-lifer, and like you as a serious Catholic, that you shouldn't betray what you believe. You need to say what you believe. But this is an election that really needs to be focused on these matters of security: economic security, security about the American dream, physical security in cities and towns. And I think what that does is put in proper perspective where abortion is as a priority, even for those of us who are pro-life conservatives. The good news is, where that has happened in the handful of elections that have existed since, it's worked really well. For example, my friend and my governor now, Governor Youngkin in Virginia, was in the news for the legislative midterms he had. He wasn't able to flip the General Assembly, and people said, "Oh, it's because of the abortion messaging." Actually, he moved with messaging like kind of like what I just said. He moved legislative districts that were Biden plus 10 to just be plus 1 districts for the Democrat. And so it's a neutralizing message. And I'll conclude with this and say people generally, and some of our polling indicates this, when they hear that explanation, even if they are people who say, no, I'm definitely not as pro-life as Heritage, or I'm pro-choice, they at least recognize there's large agreement on these other issues. The key thing for us on the political right is to give voters the permission space, if you will, to say, while I might put it a little bit different way, or maybe I'm even going to say, like with Heritage, that this needs to be a goal, I'm with them on everything else. We're encouraging candidates to talk about it that way.
I think that's fantastic. I have a personal opinion on abortion that I will never say publicly. And to me, it's one of those things where, people got upset when the Supreme Court sided with the Biden administration against Texas and then putting up the razor wire. But I think what I liked about that decision was they went strictly what their interpretation of the Constitution was. And that's why I think the Roe v. Wade being overturned was correct, because I really do think it's a state's issue. And a lot of places where it goes to the states, it goes pro-choice. And, this is why when everybody gets all upset about this, I understand that it's at this stage in my life, nothing I'm going to have to deal with. But, that's why I kind of keep my personal opinion to myself on it. And I just say, look, we have a constitution, and that's what, in my opinion, it should be like. And I just wanted to throw that in because, when the Supreme Court goes against the right gets very upset, acts as if they were somehow betrayed. Yet I think we did the right thing moving toward constitutionalist. Do you have any comment on what I just said before I ask you an actual question?
Well, I appreciate that long comment. I really do.
That gave us a chance to take a nap or two. Right. Anyway,
Yes. There you go. Pop another brandy old fashioned over there.
Oh dear. Yeah. Maybe it's good. I shouldn't denigrate
not good.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I was just being polite. Your question about basically originalism. We love the originalism at Heritage. Our Mies Legal Center, which I happen to think has the smartest legal scholars in the world, are known in this country as the greatest originalists on the political right. So we love the Dobbs decision. Just put off to the side what you think about abortion. I've heard some graduate school colleagues of mine who are left of center, definitely not with me and Heritage on abortion, who have to acknowledge the consistency of that Alito decision is really impressive. And we do have some quibbles with some aspects of the decision on the border, but actually we think the bigger decision with the fuller review by the court actually is going to be very consistent with originalism. It's actually going to protect Texas's case there. All of that to say, our opinion is the closer the court can stay to the text of the law and to what the founders intended, the better off we are. What that means is the freer we are, the more self-governing we are. It actually is very relevant to this question of abortion.
Okay, so I want to go to what my real question was going to be next is you guys are at the forefront of what you call societal rot and kind of fighting against that. And Jimmy and I are both pro Second Amendment guys. I think the Second Amendment needs to be defended by every mean allowed by the Second Amendment, quite frankly. Where does the Heritage Foundation stand on that? And being a strict constitutionalist, I think I know, but you guys have a lot of data on the Second Amendment specifically and the uses of personal defense weapons. So where do you guys fall on that?
Yeah, we're a 100 on a scale of 1 to 10. That was the case before this adopted Texan who owns dozens of guns became president of the Heritage Foundation. But it's decidedly so, and the reason is because of the Constitution. And I think we're at our best, given that we do lead with the data when we convince people who've never owned a gun, because ultimately that's the real test, right? Those of us who are into shooting because of sports, or we're into shooting because of hunting, or we're into shooting just because we like guns, or we're into shooting because we're concerned about the government. All of these are great pursuits and legitimate. It's easier to convince us. It's harder to convince people who not only have never really experienced guns, but who have, because of all the media attention, real concern about them. And I have to say, my colleague Amy Swear is the leader on this, on the political right. She leads with the data. If you've seen any of her testimonies in front of Congress, including with one senator you may know from Illinois, Senator Durbin, you know that Amy can hold her own. And she responds not with emotion, which is what the anti-gun crowd does, but with the facts. And in particular, with the really challenging fact right now, although it's good for those of us who support the Second Amendment, and it's this. Because of the concerns in some African American neighborhoods about the lack of physical security, including right here in Washington, the fastest growing segment of applicants for concealed carry permits are African American women. And I lament that they feel like they're that insecure that they need to go do this, but I celebrate that a demographic which has just been used as a tool by the radical left, including on this issue, has gotten wise to their ends and realizes the Second Amendment is just as important as the First.
So I think you said her name was Amy. Could you repeat her name for me, please?
Amy Swearer,
Okay.
Swearer.
Oh, I know who she is. Actually,
Yep.
I know that name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You will love her.
And I wanted to follow up with sort of a quick anecdote because I moved to Southwest Florida a little over 3.5 years ago. And I remember the sheriff down here saying, if you're a legal firearm owner and you feel threatened, shoot, which I don't want to joke about that, but it was a little wonderful after having gone through, the months I lived in the city limits of Chicago. And I remember we lived on a plot of land that had 3 units. And I remember talking to the 2 friends of mine the very front of our place was a young gay couple, and then a couple of color with a baby, and then myself and my wife, all in the same unit. We all got along, different political spectrums. One of them worked for the Warren campaign when she was running for office. And I remember when I got back from Southwest Florida, I spent the month of June during COVID down here, got back July 3rd, and we all sat down and had a drink and discussed how we would defend the house with our firearms if the riots were to start again. So I remember people, and Joe Rogan talked about this in one of his podcasts, saying that people who were anti-gun asking him to borrow a gun during the COVID riots. This is the kind of thing that always affects me. And you guys do really good work on the actual self-defense use of guns, which, by the way, in New York, self-defense is not a valid reason to ask for a gun permit. I just found that out. And I thought it's one of the most insane damn things I've ever heard in my life. That's not a legitimate reason to apply for a gun permit. So can you talk about some of this in terms of self-defense figures that you guys have worked out?
Yeah, Amy will be the expert on that, but I will tell you that there are far too many states. There are all the states that you would imagine, most of the blue states, where it's either impossible or very difficult to cite self-defense as a reason to get a concealed carry permit or to possess a weapon otherwise. That has to be fixed. The other troubling statistic that we often track is one that involves jail time or the persecution. I notice I said persecution, not prosecution, of people who use guns in self-defense, even though we know, witness the recent shooting at Joel Osteen's church in Houston, that whether it's that case or dozens of cases that Amy and our team keep track of every year, before law enforcement can arrive and respond, a well-trained concealed carry permit holder in a church, a law school in Virginia many years ago, they are people who neutralize the threat before law enforcement gets there. And as Amy's research points out, law enforcement are very grateful for this, particularly if the people are well-trained. All of that research leads to this conclusion, Bob, and it is, and I try to do this for folks because of all the policy we do at Heritage. What's the thing that you can do? Like, what's your homework assignment? If you're inspired by something we've said, go get a concealed carry permit. Go buy a gun. And yes, you're going to have to go do the background check. It's going to take a few minutes, or as it always happens for me, because I have a common name, it takes a long time. And the gun shop owner is looking at me like, "Are you sure you checked the right boxes on this?" And I tell them, "Yeah." And then you start seeing them circling. It's all worth it because it is just the possession of it, the competency with it. It doesn't mean you have to do it every day, but actually, you also need to keep in mind that the greatest deterrent, going back to Amy's research and your question, to someone committing a crime on you is if you possess a weapon. Some very interesting sociological data is just our comportment when we have a handgun on our person changes the response of a criminal. And that kind of thing, I think, is empowering for us, literally and figuratively.
So I take the blue. Up until recently, I took public transportation in Chicago. The blue line is one of the only lines that runs 24 hours. So it's literally become a homeless encampment. It's to call it a travesty is like an undersell. And the last day I was on it before they opened up lanes on the Kennedy I drive now, I have this spring-loaded baton, which I'm certain is probably illegal in the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago because they want to make everything illegal. But I was sitting in my chair and some drugged out homeless guy comes running down the aisle back and forth, back and forth. And then he stops at my aisle and he starts punching the wall right over my head. So I have my weapon in my hand and I'm telling the story at work. And they're like, why didn't you crack him? Because there's paperwork involved. One, I don't want to kill him. Two, I don't want to be involved in some situation where I could get in trouble for this. So the person who's being victimized, me, and the one time it happened where I reached in to grab my weapon. I think the guy thought I was going for a gun, so he ran away, which I think is weird too. But again, I don't even know where the hell I'm going with this. I called Paul Vallis. Paul Vallis and I, when he was running for mayor, he was the one who ran against Brandon Johnson. I was friendly with him up until the campaign started. I think he was trying to distance himself from anyone who really knew that he was genuinely Republican trying to act like a Democrat. So he didn't return my calls. But I thought the only way to really win is just do a whole biopic on public transportation in Chicago. Now, when people ask me if Chicago has public transportation, I say no. That's not a question, I know, but you got any comments on that shit?
Yeah, I think so. It's
where you went, right?
Well, look, actually, there's a lot there, but I'll stick to the guns. I've got a whole screed I could go on with public transportation. This story that you mentioned on public transit, or the two stories, this is precisely the kind of thing that Americans are telling us is wrong with the country. You know, those of us in Washington, those of us who are in finance, those of us who are real political junkies, we're not smarter than the average American. We happen to do jobs that force us to remain or sustain a certain access to the news. What the average American is telling us is what that story you just described, 85%, 90% of Americans, including some on the left, would say that's ridiculous and we have to fix it. The breakdown with our politicians is that they listen too much to the managerial class, the consultants who say, be a little careful on how you say that. No, tell a story like you just told the story, and let's go win some elections. And most of all, let's remember that we have a spine when we're running for election. You still have a spine when you take the oath of office, and go govern like you ran for your campaign.
Okay, speaking of a spine to say things, I don't know if you know anything about my history. I worked for a certain cable news station for 15 years, and about 3 years ago, they started not really wanting to hear what you really thought about things. And I'd get emails every time I complimented a Donald Trump policy or I bashed a Barack Obama policy, I'd get an email saying, don't be political. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm not political at all. I'm talking about policy here. And then my exit interview when they let me go was, and I've told this story before and I'm quite proud of it because they said to me, just because something's true doesn't mean you can say it on air. And I said, yeah, I mean, what you're saying, if you're talking about like if somebody's 20 pounds overweight, I'm not going to say that in air. But when I'm talking about policy, I don't agree. And then I said, stop. We can stop this whole conversation right here. I am not saying my integrity isn't for sale. I'm just saying you're 2 zeros too short. I thought that was funny. They didn't think it was funny at all, by the way.
I still think it's funny.
Glorious.
Thank you. So I went on a blaze of glory. Let's. My last policy question, I'll give the next one to Bob, is this the foreign aid bill that was described as a border bill, which just seemed to make things legal at the border. Everybody in this country, it seems like now, wants border security. I know that half the people voted for the open borders candidate, but they all pretend they didn't right now. Everybody wants border security. Why are they ignoring everything? What politically is it for them on the left to keep ignoring this?
Well, the good news is that more and more on the left are realizing this is a political problem, and so there's a deal to be had there, a good deal, by the way, not the bad deal that we defeated last week. But the reason, the origins of this is just political money in D.C. There are open borders interests, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, one of the biggest lobbying firms in essence in Washington, D.C., totally open borders. There are employers associations who say we have to have the cheap labor, America's interest be damned, the American native-born worker be damned. Two things can be true at once. You can believe that we want to have a lot of immigrants here and that they're going to flourish and be awesome, and also that we can have a really strict immigration system, and that's Heritage's position. But ultimately, just to point toward a policy solution here, this is what I've spent the majority of my time on this week, is we defeated the border non-security bill because it just would have codified the existing problems. And then you had the national security component of it, which passed the Senate today. That's not going to pass the House because, frankly, there's a lot of K Street, Washington money in there. It's almost immaterial what someone thinks about Ukraine aid. That bill is not the vehicle to get that done if you want to support Ukraine. All of that to lead to this point. It's a really simple math equation. House Resolution 2 passed the House. That's a real border security bill. The House and the Senate want some trimmed down version of pure military aid to Ukraine, to Israel, to Taiwan, a huge interest for the Heritage Foundation, because we think that's actually the real threat, the Chinese Communist Party. Offset the spending for those bills. You put those things together, it's not only good policy, but it's actually good politics. Imagine this, for both the left and the right. And so I've been encouraging any policymaker in DC who will listen, leadership, especially in the House, which is awesome under Speaker Mike Johnson, great Republican senators who filibustered this bill to do that. I can't say that I'm overwhelmingly optimistic that's going to happen, but if people in your audience are wondering, where's the common sense in this? It's that equation. HR 2 plus trimmed down, offset aid for these allies. And I actually think it's not only, as I said, good policy, but it's a political winner for the entire spectrum. And I think that's what Americans are wanting to see too.
Bob, you want the last question before I play us out?
Yeah, if I could, I wish we had more time on the immigration thing, and I wish we had more.
We're both from immigrant households, by the way, Kevin. Both Bobby and I are. So.
Yeah, I just one more thing on the Second Amendment. I had a friend of mine recently say to me that he said, you don't. Let's disagree on guns, but you don't need a high capacity magazine. And I said, why not? And he said, what do you need all those bullets for? And I said, let me ask you this. How many bullets am I allowed in a high pressure situation if 3 people are breaking into my house to protect my things and, more importantly, my wife? How many bullets am I allowed? 3? 7? I say 1 million. I'm allowed 1 million if somebody's breaking into my house to touch my wife. Now I'm getting aggravated, so I'm gonna go back to my.
No, I'm with you. I was having that conversation. We have to pay attention to security at Heritage and at home, and I want 2 million. And you know what? Even if I didn't want 2 million for that, what if I just want 2 million because I'm an American? And that's the Second Amendment. That is my damn right.
Damn straight. Love it.
Just because we're a financial show, what is the crux of inflation? Food, housing, what's Heritage's view on the sort of the crux of inflation? Why are we feeling it the way we are?
It's multifactored for sure, as y'all know better than anyone, but the crux of inflation is government spending. And it's that simple. And sometimes people will hear me say that, or hear our economists say that, and they say, oh, Heritage, they're just a bunch of shills for Republicans. Oh my gosh. Go ask some Republican senators today if the Heritage Foundation is shills for Republicans, and they will tell you, oh no, we're not really getting along with them right now because they kind of speak the hard truth. And one of the hard truth is they shouldn't have voted for that nonsense either, both under Biden or under Trump. And so we're just going to continue to hammer that point. This is the good news, and I'll be quick with this. The American people have woken up. They understand that. They may describe it a little bit different way, without the specificity that the two of you and your audience can, but they know the game's up. And all we have to do on the center right, what I like to call the common sense part of the political spectrum, is explain that we recognize why you're feeling these emotions about these problems in America. We share them too, but here's the solution. Here's the plan. Here's the vision for how we get back on track to the American dream. And that actually makes me really optimistic about the American future.
I like it. I like to leave on optimism. One thing dawned on me. If I were to live in DC, I'd be so concerned about my skin just from all the hot showers I'd have to take to get that shit off, just to be in the cesspool of DC. But I'm impressed. You seem to have nice skin. Anyway, back to the people who are
nice skin.
All the things I've said, and that's what you're going to have a problem with. All right, you people, thank you for watching. Remember, we talked about it in the lead-in up on Twitter, is that we did not ask for this, and we have to choose our fighter. I like these guys. I think they got good heads on their shoulders, and almost everything they say, I agree with. And they live on donations. So please, dust out your wallet, get out your checkbook. They can't do their job unless they have money donation. I don't mean this to be a commercial, but I do really believe that we have to fight for this shit. Do you have anything inappropriate to say, Bob or Kevin?
No, I want Kevin to be able to say where people can find.
Oh, please,
social
Kevin. Yeah, where
places
can they
to
find you?
Yeah, I'll keep it appropriate since it's a spirit of gratitude. Thank you guys for the conversation, and thank you all for considering to help us out. You can find us at heritage.org. We are, in fact, all of us, not just me, but the 300 of us who have the privilege of working here. We fight every day for the everyday American here behind enemy lines in Washington, D.C.
How about it?
If
That was a
nothing
great
else,
way to
go
end it.
there and read what's on the website, guys. Seriously.
Love it.
If
Thanks
nothing
so
else.
much, Kevin. A ton of fun.